Command line interface.
A command line interface, also known as command line user interface, console user interface, and character user interface, is a means of interacting with a computer program where the user issues commands to the program in the form of successive lines of text. The CLI was the primary means of interaction with most computer systems until the introduction of the video display terminal in the mid-1960s, and continued to be used throughout the 1970s and 1980s on Unix systems and personal computer systems including MS-DOS, CP/M and Apple DOS. The interface is usually implemented with a command line shell, which is a program that accepts commands as text input and converts commands to appropriate operating system functions. Command line interfaces to computer operating systems are less widely used by casual computer users, who favor graphical user interfaces. Command line interfaces are often preferred by more advanced computer users, as they often provide a more concise and powerful means to control a program or operating system. Programs with command line interfaces are generally easier to automate via scripting. Alternatives to the command line include, but are not limited to, text user interface menus, CIBM AIX SMIT for example, keyboard shortcuts, and various other desktop metaphors centered on the pointer, usually controlled with a mouse.
Operating system command line interfaces.
Operating system, OS, command line interfaces are usually distinct programs supplied with the operating system. A program that implements such a text interface is often called a command line interpreter, command processor or shell. The term shell, often used to describe a command line interpreter, can be in principle any program that constitutes the user interface, including fully graphically oriented ones. For example, the default Windows GUI is created by a shell program named ExplorerX, as defined in the shell equals ExplorerX line in the WinRAR configuration file. Examples of command line interpreters include the various Unix shells, sh, ksh, csh, tcsh, bash, etc., the historical CP/M CCP, and MS-DOS IBM DOS. Dr. DOS's command.com, as well as the OS/2 and the Windows Commander EXE programs, the latter groups being based heavily on December's OSX and OSTS CLIs. Under most operating systems, it is possible to replace the default shell program with alternatives. Examples include 4DOS for DOS, 4OS2 for OS/2, and 4NT or Take Command for Windows.
Application command line interfaces.
Application programs, as opposed to operating systems, may also have command line interfaces. An application program may support none, any, or all of these three major types of command line interface mechanisms. Parameters. Most operating systems support a means to pass additional information to a program when it is launched. When a program is launched from an OS command line shell, additional text provided along with the program name is passed to the launched program. Interactive command line sessions. After launch, a program may provide an operator with an independent means to enter commands in the form of text. OS inter-process communication. Most operating systems support means of inter-process communication, for example, standard streams or named pipes. Command lines from client processes may be redirected to a CLI program by one of these methods.
CLI software.
Some applications support only a CLI, presenting a CLI prompt to the user and acting upon command lines as they are entered. Some examples of CLI-only applications are debug, diskpart, idlin, fdisk, ping.
Hybrid software.
Some computer programs support both a CLI and a GUI. In some cases, a GUI is simply a wrapper around a separate CLI executable file. In other cases, a program may provide a CLI as an optional alternative to its GUI. Both interfaces do not always offer similar functionality. For example, MATLAB, a numerical analysis computer program, provides no GUI for some calculations, but the CLI can handle any calculation MATLAB supports. The early Sierra games, like the first three King's Quest games, 1984 to 1986, use commands from an internal command line to move the character around in the graphic window.
History.
The command line interface evolved from a form of dialogue once conducted by humans over teleprinter, TTY, machines, in which human operators remotely exchanged information, usually one line of text at a time. Early computer systems often used teleprinter machines as the means of interaction with a human operator. The computer became one end of the human-to-human teleprinter model. So instead of a human communicating with another human over a teleprinter, a human communicated with a computer. In time, the actual mechanical teleprinter was replaced by a glass TTY, keyboard and screen, but emulating the teleprinter, and then by a smart terminal, where a microprocessor in the terminal could address all of the screen, rather than only print successive lines. As the microcomputer revolution replaced the traditional mini-computer plus terminals time-sharing architecture, hardware terminals became replaced by terminal emulators, PC software that interpreted terminal signals sent through the PC's serial ports. These were typically used to interface an organization's new PCs with their existing mini or mainframe computers, or to connect PC to PC. Some of these PCs were running bulletin board systems software. Early microcomputers themselves were based on a command line interface such as CP/M, MS-DOS or AppleSoft BASIC. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, especially after the introduction of the Apple Macintosh and Microsoft Windows, command line interfaces were replaced in popular usage by the graphical user interface. The command line remains in use, however, by advanced users for computer programming and batch processing. In November 2006, Microsoft released version 1.0 of Windows PowerShell, formerly codenamed Monad, which combined features of traditional Unix shells with their proprietary object-oriented .NET framework. MinGW and Cygwin are open-source packages for Windows that offer a Unix-like CLI. Microsoft provides MKS Incorporated's KSH implementation MKS Corn Shell for Windows through their Services for Unix add-on. Since 2001, the Macintosh operating system is based on a variation of Unix called Darwin. On these computers, users can access a Unix-like command line interface called Terminal found in the Applications Utilities folder. This terminal uses Bash by default.
Usage.
A CLI is used whenever a large vocabulary of commands or queries, coupled with a wide, or arbitrary, range of options, can be entered more rapidly as text than with a pure GUI. This is typically the case with operating system command shells. CLIs are also used by systems with insufficient resources to support a graphical user interface. Some computer language systems, such as Python, Forth, Lisp, Regs, and many dialects of BASIC, provide an interactive command line mode to allow for rapid evaluation of code. CLIs are often used by programmers and system administrators, in engineering and scientific environments, and by technically advanced personal computer users. CLIs are also popular among people with visual disability, since the commands and responses can be displayed using refreshable braille displays.
Anatomy of a shell CLI.
The general pattern of an OS command line interface is prompt command param1 param2 param3. Param-N. Prompt, generated by the program to provide context for the client. Command, provided by the client. Commands are usually one of three classes. Internal, recognized and processed by the command line interpreter itself and not dependent upon any external executable file. Included, a separate executable file generally considered part of the operating environment and always included with the OS. External, external executable files not part of the basic OS, but added by other parties for specific purposes and applications. Internal, recognized and processed by the command line interpreter itself and not dependent upon any external executable file. Included, a separate executable file generally considered part of the operating environment and always included with the OS. External executable files not part of the basic OS, but added by other parties for specific purposes and applications. Param 1. Param N, optional parameters provided by the client. The format and meaning of the parameters depends upon the command issued. In the case of included or external commands, the values of the parameters are delivered to the program, specified by the command, as it is launched by the OS. Parameters may be either arguments or options. In this example, the delimiters between command line elements are whitespace characters and the end-of-line delimiter is the new line delimiter. This is a widely used, but not universal, convention for command line interfaces. A CLI can generally be considered as consisting of syntax and semantics. The syntax is the grammar that all commands must follow. In the case of operating systems, OS, MS-DOS and Unix each define their own set of rules that all commands must follow. In the case of embedded systems, each vendor, such as Nortel, Juniper Networks or Cisco Systems, defines their own proprietary set of rules that all commands within their CLI conform to. These rules also dictate how a user navigates through the system of commands. The semantics define what sort of operations are possible, on what sort of data these operations can be performed, and how the grammar represents these operations and data, the symbolic meaning and the syntax. Two different CLIs may agree on either syntax or semantics, but it is only when they agree on both that they can be considered sufficiently similar to allow users to use both CLIs without needing to learn anything, as well as to enable reuse of scripts. A simple CLI will display a prompt, accept a command line typed by the user terminated by the enter key, then execute the specified command and provide textual display of results or error messages. Advanced CLIs will validate, interpret and parameter expand the command line before executing the specified command, and optionally capture or redirect its output. Unlike a button or menu item in a GUI, a command line is typically self-documenting, stating exactly what the user wants done. In addition, command lines usually include many defaults that can be changed to customize the results. Useful command lines can be saved by assigning a character string or alias to represent the full command, or several commands can be grouped to perform a more complex sequence, for instance, compile the program, install it, and run it, creating a single entity, called a command procedure or script which itself can be treated as a command. These advantages mean that a user must figure out a complex command or series of commands only once, because they can be saved, to be used again. The commands given to a CLI shell are often in one of the following forms. Dosa-me-thing how-to files, Dosa-me-thing how source file destination file, Dosa-me-thing how less than input file greater than output file, Dosa-me-thing how do something how greater than output file. Where do something is, in effect, a verb, how an adverb. For example, should the command be executed verbosely, or quietly into files an object or objects, typically one or more files, on which the command should act. The greater than in the third example is a redirection operator, telling the command line interpreter to send the output of the command not to its own standard output, the screen, but to the named file. This will overwrite the file. Using greater than will redirect the output and append it to the file. Another redirection operator is the vertical bar, which creates a pipeline where the output of one command becomes the input to the next command.
CLI and resource protection.
One can modify the set of available commands by modifying which paths appear in the path environment variable. Under Unix, commands also need be marked as executable files. The directories in the path variable are searched in the order they are given. By reordering the path, one can run for example /os2 /mdos /ex instead of /os2 /ex, when the default is the opposite. Renaming of the executables also works. People often rename their favorite editor to edit, for example. The command line allows one to restrict available commands, such as access to advanced internal commands. The Windows Commander exe does this. Often, shareware programs will limit the range of commands, including printing a command your administrator has disabled running batch files from the prompt. Some CLIs, such as those in network routers, have a hierarchy of modes, with a different set of commands supported in each mode. The set of commands are grouped by association with security, system, interface, etc. In these systems the user might traverse through a series of submodes. For example, if the CLI had two modes called interface and system, the user might use the command interface to enter the interface mode. At this point, commands from the system mode may not be accessible and the user exits the interface mode and enters the system mode.
Command prompt.
A command prompt, or just prompt, is a sequence of one or more characters used in a command line interface to indicate readiness to accept commands. Its intent is to literally prompt the user to take action. A prompt usually ends with one of the characters $%, greater than, and often includes other information, such as the path of the current working directory. On many Unix system and derivative systems, it is common for the prompt to end in a $ or % character if the user is a normal user, but in a character if the user is a super user, root in Unix terminology. It is common for prompts to be modifiable by the user. Depending on the environment, they may include colors, special characters, and other elements like variables and functions for the current time, user, shell number or working directory, in order, for instance, to make the prompt more informative or visually pleasing, to distinguish sessions on various machines, or to indicate the current level of nesting of commands. On some systems, special tokens in the definition of the prompt can be used to cause external programs to be called by the command line interpreter while displaying the prompt. In DOS's command.com and in the Windows NT's command line interpreter CMDX, the prompt is modifiable by issuing a prompt command or by directly changing the value of the corresponding %prompt %environment variable. The default of most modern systems, the C \greater than style is obtained, for instance, with prompt $p$g. The default of older DOS systems, greater than, is obtained by just prompt, although on some systems this produces the newer C \greater than style, unless used on floppy drives A or B. On those systems prompt $n$g can be used to override the automatic default and explicitly switch to the older style. On many Unix systems, the $ps1 variable can be used, although other variables also may have an impact on the prompt, depending on what shell is being used. In the bash shell, a prompt of the form could be set by issuing the command. In ZSH, the $prompt variable controls an optional prompt on the right-hand side of the display. It is not a real prompt in that the location of text entry does not change. It is used to display information on the same line as the prompt, but write justified. In RISC OS, the command prompt is an * symbol, and thus, OS CLI commands are often referred to as star commands. It is also possible to access the same commands from other command lines, such as the BBC Basic command line, by preceding the command with *.
Arguments.
A command line argument or parameter is an item of information provided to a program when it is started. A program can have many command line arguments that identify sources or destinations of information, or that alter the operation of the program. When a command processor is active, a program is typically invoked by typing its name followed by command line arguments, if any. For example, in Unix and Unix-like environments, an example of a command line argument is files is a command line argument which tells the program rm to remove the file files. Some programming languages, such as C, C++, and Java, allow a program to interpret the command line arguments by handling them as string parameters in the main function. Other languages, such as Python, expose these arguments as global variables. In Unix-like operating systems, a single -" by itself is usually a special value specifying that a program should handle data coming from the standard input or send data to the standard output.
Command line option.
A command line option, or simply option, also known as a flag or switch, modifies the operation of a command. The effect is determined by the command's program. Options follow the command name on the command line, separated by spaces. A space before the first option is not always required. For example, in the OpenVMS operating system, the command directory is used to list the files inside a directory. By default, that is, when the user simply types directory, it will list only the names of the files. By appending the /owner option, to form the command directory owner, the user can instruct the directory command to also display the ownership of the files. The format of options varies widely between operating systems. In most cases the syntax is by convention rather than an operating system requirement. The entire command line is simply a string passed to a program, which can process it in any way the programmer wants. In Multics, command line options and subsystem keywords may be abbreviated. This idea appears to derive from the PLI programming language, with its shortened keywords, for example, strg for string range and DCL for declare. For example, in the Multics forum subsystem, the long subject parameter can be abbreviated LGSJ. It is also common for Multics commands to be abbreviated, typically corresponding to the initial letters of the words that are strung together with underscores to form command names, such as the use of did for delete IACL-dir. On Windows, different programs use different syntax in the same operating system. For example, options may be indicated by / or either. They may or may not be case-sensitive. Sometimes options and their arguments are run together, sometimes separated by whitespace, and sometimes by a character, typically, or equals. Thus prog-f file name, prog-f file name, prog-f, file name, prog-f equals file name. Some programs allow single-character options to be combined. Others do not. The switch FA may mean the same as FA, or it may be incorrect, or it may even be a valid but different parameter. In Unix-like systems, the ASCII -- is commonly used to specify options. The character is usually followed by one or more letters. 2-– characters often indicate that the remaining arguments should not be treated as options, which is useful for example if a file name itself begins with a hyphen, or if further arguments are meant for an inner command. Double -– are also sometimes used to prefix long options, where more descriptive option names are used. This is a common feature of GNU software. The jetopt functioning program, and the jetopts command are usually used for parsing command line options. In DOS, OS/2 and Windows, the / is more prevalent, although the -– is also sometimes used. FlexOS, 4680 OS and 4690 OS use --. In many versions of DOS, MS-DOS PC DOS 2XX and higher, all versions of Drive DOS since 5.0, as well as in PTS DOS and FreeDOS, the switch character to be used is defined by a value returned from a system call, int21/AH equals 37H. The default character returned by this API is /, but can be changed to a -– on the above-mentioned systems, except for MS-DOS PC DOS 5.0 and higher. In some of these systems, MS-DOS PC DOS 2XX/3XX, DOS plus 2.1, Dr. DOS 7.02 and higher, FreeDOS and RxDOS, the setting can not only be controlled by programs, but also pre-configured by a switchar directive and configs as many programs are hardwired to use / only, rather than retrieving this setting before parsing command line arguments. Under Drive DOS, if the setting has been changed from /, the first directory separator \/ the display of the prompt parameter $G will change to a //, also a valid directory separator in DOS, FlexOS, 4680 OS, 4690 OS, OS/2 and Windows, as a visual clue to indicate the change. Some command line interpreters, including newer versions of Drive DOS Command.com and 4DOS, also provides pseudo-environment variables named %per% or %switch are % to allow portable bait jobs to be written. Conversational Monitor System, CMS, uses a single left parenthesis to separate options at the end of the command from the other arguments. For example, in the following command the options indicate that the target file should be replaced if it exists, and the date and time of the source file should be retained on the copy source file. A target file be replace old date.
Built-in usage help.
It is usual for a program to be able to display a brief summary of its parameters, typically when invoked with no arguments or one of h, /h, help, or help. Entering a program name without parameters in the hope that it will display parameters can be hazardous, as some programs and scripts execute without further ado. Although desirable at least for the help parameter, programs may not support all option leading characters exemplified above. Under DOS, where the default command line option character can be changed from /to, programs may query the switch-r API in order to determine the current setting. So, if a program is not hardwired to support them all, a user may need to know the current setting even to be able to reliably request help. If the switch-r has been changed to, and therefore the / character is accepted as alternative path delimiter also at the DOS command line, programs may misinterpret options like /h or /h as paths rather than help parameters. However, if given as first or only parameter, most DOS programs will, by convention, accept it as request for help regardless of the current switch-r setting. In some cases, different levels of help can be selected for a program. Some programs supporting this allow to give a verbosity level as an optional argument to the help parameter, as in /h1, /h2, etc., or they give just a short help on help parameters with question mark and a longer help screen for the other help options. Depending on the program, additional or more specific help on accepted parameters is sometimes available by either providing the parameter in question as an argument to the help parameter or vice versa, as in /h(w) or in /w. Assuming /w would be another parameter supported by the program. In a similar fashion to the help parameter, but much less common, some programs provide additional information about themselves, like mode, status, version, author, license or contact information, when invoked with an about parameter like /about or about. Since the and characters typically also serve other purposes at the command line, they may not be available in all scenarios, therefore, they should not be the only options to access the corresponding help information. If more detailed help is necessary than provided by a program's built-in internal help, many systems support a dedicated external help command, or similar, which accepts a command name as calling parameter and will invoke an external help system. In the Drive DOS family, typing / or /h at the command.com prompt instead of a command itself will display a dynamically generated list of available internal commands. For DOS and NDOS support the same feature by typing at the prompt, also accepted by newer versions of Drive DOS command.com. In addition to this, some newer versions of Drive DOS command.com also accept a % command to display a list of available built-in variable functions, similar to environment variables. Besides their purpose as quick help reference, this can be used in bait jobs to query the facilities of the underlying command line processor.
Command description syntax.
Built-in usage help and man pages commonly employ a small syntax to describe the valid command form. Angle brackets for required parameters, ping less than hosname greater than, square brackets for optional parameters, mkdir less than dirname greater than, ellipses for repeated items, cp less than source1 greater than less than des greater than, vertical bars for choice of items, nets.tu. Notice that these characters have different meanings than when used directly in the shell. Angle brackets may be omitted when confusing the parameter name with a literal string as not likely.
The space character.
In many areas of computing, but particularly in the command line, the space character can cause problems as it has two distinct and incompatible functions, as part of a command or parameter, or as a parameter or name separator. Ambiguity can be prevented either by prohibiting embedded spaces in file and directory names in the first place, for example, by substituting them with underscores underscore, or by enclosing a name with embedded spaces between quote characters, or using an escape character before the space, usually a backslash. For example, is ambiguous, is program name part of the program name, or two parameters? However, and are not ambiguous. Unix-based operating systems minimize the use of embedded spaces to minimize the need for quotes. In Microsoft Windows, one often has to use quotes because embedded spaces, such as in directory names, are common.
Command line interpreter.
The terms command line interpreter, command line shell, command language interpreter, or identical abbreviation CLI, are applied to computer programs designed to interpret a sequence of lines of text which may be entered by a user, read from a file or another kind of data stream. The context of interpretation is usually one of a given operating system or programming language. Command line interpreters allow users to issue various commands in a very efficient, and often terse, way. This requires the user to know the names of the commands and their parameters, and the syntax of the language that is interpreted. The Unix and OS/2extproc commands facilitate the passing of batch files to external processors. One can use this to write specific command processors for dedicated uses, and process external data files which reside in batch files. Many graphical interfaces, such as the OS/2 Presentation Manager and early versions of Microsoft Windows, use command lines to call helper programs to open documents and programs. The commands are stored in the graphical shell or in files like the registry or the OS/2 OS/2 user .ini file.
Early history.
The earliest computers did not support interactive input-output devices, often relying on sense switches and lights to communicate with the computer operator. This was adequate for batch systems that ran one program at a time, often with the programmer acting as operator. This also had the advantage of low overhead, since lights and switches could be tested and set with one machine instruction. Later a single system console was added to allow the operator to communicate with the system. From the 1960s onwards, user interaction with computers was primarily by means of command line interfaces, initially on machines like the Teletype Model 33ASR, but then on early CRT-based computer terminals such as the VT52. All of these devices were purely text-based, with no ability to display graphic or pictures. For business application programs, text-based menus were used, but for more general interaction the command line was the interface. Around 1964 Louis Pouzin introduced the concept in the name shell in Multics, building on earlier, simpler facilities in the Compatible Time-Sharing System, CTSS. From the early 1970s the Unix operating system adapted the concept of a powerful command line environment, and introduced the ability to pipe the output of one command in as input to another. Unix also had the capability to save and rerun strings of commands as shell scripts, which acted like custom commands. The command line was also the main interface for the early home computers such as the Commodore PET, Apple II and BBC Micro, almost always in the form of a basic interpreter. When more powerful business-oriented microcomputers arrived with CP/M and later MS-DOS computers such as the IBM PC, the command line began to borrow some of the syntax and features of the Unix shells such as globbing and piping of output. The command line was first seriously challenged by the PARC GUI approach used in the 1983 Apple Lisa and the 1984 Apple Macintosh. The majority of IBM PC users did not replace their Command.com shell with a GUI until Windows 95 was released in 1995.
Modern usage is an operating system shell.
While most computer users now use a GUI almost exclusively, more advanced users have access to powerful command line environments. IBM OS/2 has the CMDX processor. This copies the command.com commands, with extensions to OREXX. Windows users have a CLI environment named Command Prompt, which might use the script interface to alternate programs. The new PowerShell program provides a command line interface, but its applets are not written in shell script. Implementations of the Unix shell are also available as part of the POSIX subsystem, Cygwin, and other software packages. FreeBSD uses CSH as its default interactive shell. Apple Mac OS X and many Linux distributions have the Bash implementation of the Unix shell. Early versions of OS X used TCSH as the default shell. Embedded Linux, and other embedded Unix-like devices often use the ASH implementation of the Unix shell, as part of BusyBox. Android uses the MKSH shell, a shell derived from ASH in older versions, with commands from the separate toolbox. Routers with Cisco iOS, Junos and many others are commonly configured from the command line.
Scripting.
Most command line interpreters support scripting, to various extents. They are, after all, interpreters of an interpreted programming language, albeit in many cases the language is unique to the particular command line interpreter. They will interpret scripts, variously termed shell scripts or batch files, written in the language that they interpret. Some command line interpreters also incorporate the interpreter engines of other languages, such as OREXX, in addition to their own, allowing the executing of scripts, in those languages, directly within the command line interpreter itself. Conversely, scripting programming languages, in particular those with an eval function, such as OREXX, Perl, Python, Ruby or Jython, can be used to implement command line interpreters and filters. For a few operating systems, most notably DOS, such a command interpreter provides a more flexible command line interface than the one supplied. In other cases, such a command interpreter can present a highly customized user interface employing the user interface and input-output facilities of the language.
Other command line interfaces.
The command line provides an interface between programs as well as the user. In this sense, a command line is an alternative to a dialog. Editors and databases present a command line, in which alternate command processors might run. On the other hand, one might have options on the command line which opens a dialog box. The latest version of Take Command has this feature. Database used a dialog box to construct command lines, which could be further edited before use. Programs like BASIC, DiskPart, idlin, and QBASIC all provide command line interfaces, some of which use the system shell. BASIC is modeled on the default interface for 8-bit Intel computers. Calculators can be run as command line or dialog interfaces. There are a number of green-mouse games, like Adventure or King's Quest 1-3, which relied on the user typing commands at the bottom of the screen. One controls the character by typing commands like get, ring or look. The program returns a dialog which describes how the character sees it, or makes the action happen. The text adventure The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a piece of interactive fiction based on Douglas Adams' book of the same name, is a teletype-style command line game. The most notable of these interfaces is the standard Streams interface, which allows the output of one command to be passed to the input of another. Text files can serve either purpose as well. This provides the interfaces of piping, filters and redirection. Under Unix, devices are files too, so the normal type of file for the shell used for stdin, stdout and stderr is a tty device file. Another command line interface allows a shell program to launch helper programs, either to launch documents or start a program. The command is processed internally by the shell, and then passed on to another program to launch the document. The graphical interface of Windows and OS/2 rely heavily on command lines passed through to other programs, console or graphical, which then usually process the command line without presenting a user console. Programs like the OS/2 editor and some other IBM editors can process command lines normally meant for the shell, the output being placed directly in the document window. A web browser's URL input field can be used as a command line. It can be used to launch web apps, access browser configuration, as well as perform a search. Google, which has been called the command line of the Internet, will perform a domain-specific search when it detects search parameters in a known format. This functionality is present whether the search is triggered from a browser field or one on Google's website.
Quotes. Command line interface.
A command line interface, also known as command line user interface, console user interface, and character user interface, is a means of interacting with a computer program where the user issues commands to the program in the form of successive lines of text. The CLI was the primary means of interaction with most computer systems until the introduction of the video display terminal in the mid-1960s, and continued to be used throughout the 1970s and 1980s on Unix systems and personal computer systems including MS-DOS, CP/M and Apple DOS. The interface is usually implemented with a command line shell, which is a program that accepts commands as text input and converts commands to appropriate any, or all of these three major types of command line interface mechanisms. Parameters. Most operating systems support a means to pass additional information to a program when it is launched. When a program is launched from an OS command line shell, additional text provided along with the program name is passed to the launched program. Interactive command line sessions. After launch, a program may provide an operator with an independent means to enter commands in the form of text. OS inter-process communication. Most operating systems support means of inter-process communication, for example, standard streams or named pipes. Command lines from client processes may be redirected to a CLI program by one of these methods, bash, etc. The historical CP/M CCP, and MS-DOS IBM DOS Dr. DOS's command.com, as well as the OS/2 and the Windows Commander EXE programs, the latter groups being based heavily on December's OSX and OSTS CLIs. Under most operating systems, it is possible to replace the default shell program with alternatives. Examples include 4DOS for DOS, 4OS2 for OS/2, and 4NT or take command for Windows.
Application command line interfaces.
Application programs, as opposed to operating systems, may also have command line interfaces. An application program may support none, any operating system functions. Command line interfaces to computer operating systems are less widely used by casual computer users, who favor graphical user interfaces. Command line interfaces are often preferred by more advanced computer users, as they often provide a more concise and powerful means to control a program or operating system. Programs with command line interfaces are generally easier to automate via scripting. Alternatives to the command line include, but are not limited to, text user interface menus, IBM AIX SMIT for example, keyboard shortcuts, and various other desktop metaphors centered on the pointer, usually controlled with a mouse.
Operating system command line interfaces.
Operating system, OS, command line interfaces are usually distinct programs supplied with the operating system. A program that implements such a text interface is often called a command line interpreter, command processor or shell. The term shell, often used to describe a command line interpreter, can be in principle any program that constitutes the user interface, including fully graphically oriented ones. For example, the default Windows GUI is created by a shell program named ExplorerX, as defined in the shell equals ExplorerX line in the WinNI configuration file. Examples of command line interpreters include the various Unix shells, KSH, CSH, TCSH,